I know it sounds silly, but has anyone ever heard this old poem about the clickety-clackety? I don't know if it's just something from my small town that they kept alive or what, but I've been trying to do some research about it for the last few weeks. I haven't come up with much, and I'm looking for help. Honestly, at this point, I'm really begging for someone who has some information on this thing to step forward. But this is the poem I'm talking about. In these woods there lives a puppet. It sits and watches all who pass, with eyes of coal and teeth of rust, with skin crackling and full of crust, with wiry limbs, brittle as spent glass. It moves with subtle creaks and cracks. So if you're ever in the woods and see a puppet sitting near, do not look at it, no matter your fear. Just pretend you're okay. That's truly all I can say. In these woods, there lives a puppet. For some context, I live in the southern edge of Wisconsin. My family has always been pretty savvy when it comes to camping, and it was a big thing for my brother Paul and I growing up. We always had fun during family camping trips. But flash forward 20 years, and my parents have since passed on. There was a bad car accident, and the loss hit us unexpectedly. So, as a little remembrance trip, my brother and I had planned a final journey up into the woods that our family had frequented. It's up near the town of Clements, Wisconsin. It's where my family had always camped, but this time we were going in deeper into the woods, just to have a little extra privacy from the normal campground tenants. Plus, we were planning on getting a little drunk, so we didn't want any officers kicking us out. So, we made our plans. We were going to meet at 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon in the parking lot of the Clements Park campground, after which we'd head up north for a couple of hours. We'd found a decent spot in a clearing through Google Map, and we wanted to check it out. After all was said and done, the plan was to head back to our cars on Sunday afternoon. It was just a dumb, drunk, grieving kind of weekend getaway. We both wanted to talk things through, but neither of us could really be described as the going through armchair therapy sort of people. This is just how we handled things. But once Friday came around, things immediately went south. I'd parked my car in the run-down dirt lot of the Clements Park around 2:30. There were a few scattered cars of other campers littered around the dirt field, but nothing really of note. In a way, I'd felt relieved that I wouldn't have to exchange pleasantries with any old family friends. But although I didn't see any familiar people, I did see familiar faces. The trees that had stood tall since I was a kid still remained in their proper places. They held on rebelliously firm to their plots and were left untouched by time. If anything, they had appeared larger to me that day. They had loomed over me with an intensity that I hadn't felt in years. Either they had grown larger, or I had felt much smaller. With a deep breath, I took in the strong, nostalgic smell of the cypress and pine trees that filled the woods. It had always amazed me that the memory could be triggered so heavily with scent. The smell of fresh trees and dirt had taken me back to simpler times of life, when you entrusted your whole being to the care of others, when you were so little that your parents had seemed unstoppable by the forces of nature. You felt carefree because your parents could protect you. You never had to worry about yourself. Now that I was an adult, I knew that whole premise was faulty from the start. When death arrives, it arrives. It doesn't matter how much experience or wisdom you have. It has always, and will always, take what it wants. After a few minutes, I checked my phone and saw 2 unread text messages from Paul. He wrote that he was going to be a few hours late due to work, but told me to just go ahead without him. He said he'd meet me at the clearing sometime in the evening. I remember feeling disappointed in him. I know it wasn't his fault. He had a rough job, but this was supposed to be our time together. Our time to BS and get everything off our chest. I knew that, at the end of the day, there was nothing I could do about it. I just thought, whatever, and kept moving about with our plans. I walked behind my rusted little Honda Civic and popped open the trunk. What was inside my beaten-up sedan was worth more to me than my entire life's work. Right in front of me lay the same beaten-up rucksack that my dad had always taken with us. When he passed, my brother and I found all his camping gear still prepped and ready to go in the garage. At that point, we hadn't camped together for at least a decade. As a man, I held back tears as we found it. I think Paul had too. "Hey, Dad," I remembered saying as I picked up the heavy bag. "We're going on another trip together. Paul will be here soon." I looked towards the dirt path leading deeper into the woods and knew it was going to be one hell of a trek forward. It was pretty well known in our town that the trees in Clement's woods weren't exactly easy to travel through. There were thick patches of dry rotted tree limbs that had entangled and knotted around each other. One bad foot placement, and you'd end up snapping more than just tree limbs. With that in the back of my mind, I started my journey. The first thing you have to pass through is the standard campsites. They were full of beat-up trailers and half-assed tents. We called most of the trailers out there the regulars. They pretty much lived out there during the summer. They were good people, just a little odd. Once you got past most of them, you finally hit the start of Clement's Trail. It's less of a sanctioned path and more of a dusty foot trail. Years of fishermen coming and going had created a thin line of dirt that my family had enjoyed walking through for well over a decade. My brother and I walked down that exact path time and time again with our parents. It was basically a mile loop around a lake that happened to find itself surrounded by jack pines and red cedars that had made up the bulk of Clement's ecosystem. Past that was relatively untouched land. Now, was it legal for us to camp out past the sanctioned areas? Probably not. But what conservation officer would head several hours into the woods on a hunch there might be some buffoons grieving out there? So I pressed forward, continuing northward as I went into the depths of the tree line. Before I knew it, the Clements campground were out of sight and out of mind. During my hike, I used the sun as my marker and kept a good pace. I was actually a little ahead of schedule without having to keep pace with Paul. Incredibly, it was just over an hour of me walking due north that I started noticing something. There was this odd creaking noise coming from the distance just beyond me. It didn't sound like much of anything at first, just kind of like a tree cracking in the breeze. But when it kept happening, always the same distance away and always directly behind me, I started to get an odd feeling creeping up against the back of my mind. Yet every time I turned around to look at whatever was making that noise, I'd see the gentle swaying of green leaves overhead and the sand-colored trunks of the cedar trees, and nothing else. So every time I got that odd feeling running up my spine, I'd turn around and see nothing, then just keep marching on. This happened over and over again. It wasn't until I got to the clearing that something else popped into my head. I hadn't heard a single bird call that entire walk. Aside from the creaking of tree branches and the whistling of the wind, it had been dead quiet. But once again, I pushed it out of my mind. I shifted my focus to setting up the campsite for Paul and I. The clearing we had chosen was perfect. It actually looked better in person than it did on the overhead view from online. It was an almost perfect circle of grass, surrounded by a dense woodline. You could see the sun overhead, casting its dim glow from just over the top of the green canopy. I relaxed my mind a bit, now that I had gotten safely to our makeshift campsite. I went through the mental checklist of everything I had to prepare for the night. I started with the fire. I collected a few big stones that littered the forest floor and formed a little rock pit in the dead center of the clearing. Shortly after that, I made a big pile of dry firewood that I had found scattered around the ground. I did my best to fill the fire pit with the best wood I could find, and tried to spark the tinder with my dad's fire starter. The fire starter went off without a hitch, and it was just in time for the evening sun to start cresting over the horizon. Even though I felt a little rushed setting up the campsite on my own, there was something relaxing about focusing on a single task. I wished Paul was with me, but part of me needed some silence to sort out my own thoughts. The fire provided enough light for me to set up the 3-man tent without issue. Before long, I was sitting by the fire, getting ready to open up the cooler and have a drink. That's when I finally got the text from my brother. "Hey, just FYI, I just got here. I'll be there in about 2 hours. I know a lot of you probably think hiking in the woods in the dark is stupid. You're right, we aren't the brightest tools in the shed, but we had an oversized ego for our capabilities. We'd been hiking and camping on our own for so long that it felt like second nature to us. I just texted him back with my thumbs up and fished out a drink. I sat my back against a broken cedar trunk near the fire and looked at my handiwork. 'Here's to you, Mom and Dad,' I muttered, before having a sip of my drink. Before I knew it, the cans had gathered next to me, and my eyes had gotten heavy. My eyes were half closed when I heard the same clinking noise I'd heard earlier. It was just outside the clearing, in the darkening woodline. My eyes drifted towards the edge of the trees and focused in on something directly across from me. There in the darkness of the sunless forest was a vague shape of something. It was barely noticeable in the shadows. It stood about 4 feet tall, and it was facing me. I slowly leaned myself forward off the tree trunk, my eyes fixated on the small, dark form. I was expecting it to turn and run away from me. It wouldn't have been the first time that I'd been spooked by a deer in the night. I thought to myself that any second now I'd hear the skittering of the deer hooves as they scampered back into the woods. But that's not what happened. As my eyes were focused on the little shape, it started to walk towards me. And by walk, I mean walk. Even with it being cast in shadow, I could tell that it had the frame of a small child. It was deathly thin and gaunt. It moved with a sense of weightlessness to it. The moment that it passed into the camp's clearing, the fire licked its face with light. Even through my drunken eyes, I could see what it was. It was the face of an old wooden marionette. I felt my heart lurch up in my throat. My body had instantly skipped the fight-or-flight response and went straight into freeze. I could no more lift a finger of my hand. All I could do was watch and examine the puppet's features. The wood was old and weathered, cracks and chips layering its pale skin. The eyes themselves were dark and empty, and the mouth was just a gaping hole full of rusted metal false teeth. It had what appeared to be human hair matted over its wooden scalp. It was just staring at me. Time passed, and it just kept staring. I worked up enough courage to slowly slide my hands towards my flashlight. I slowly aimed the bulb towards the thing at the edge of the camp and flipped the switch. Immediately, the puppet shot its hands up in the air and jittered its way towards me. Loud cracking and popping of aged wood filled the campsite. Its feet had glided its way over the forest floor as if it were floating, its knees bounding high up in the air with every mocking step. The clattering sound of wood on wood jangling in the empty void of darkness still haunts me. I dropped my flashlight and fell into the fetal position, completely curling up. My subconscious told me that I was already dead, and my body had totally given up in response. I counted the seconds in my head, waiting for whatever nightmare was about to befall me. But it didn't. I lay on the forest floor in a tight ball for God knows how many minutes. Eventually, I worked up the courage to take a glance at my tormentor. Through my fingers, I peered into my campsite, praying that the thing would be gone. But the puppet was still there. It was now halfway between the fire and me. The wind was blowing against its hardened skin, creaking its body ever so slightly with every gentle gust. Out of its mouth came a light clicking noise, almost like an infestation of woodworms, all calling out. What do I do? I remember repeating in my head, what do I do? Then I remembered the poem from when I was a kid. I remembered what it said. Just pretend you're okay. So I slowly sat up and kept the puppet in my peripheral vision. It turned to face me, but I did my best not to pay attention. You're at camp. Act like you're at camp, I silently recited to myself. I noticed that the fires of the fire pit had begun to dim. I needed to stock the pit again before the light went out completely. I looked over to the large stock of dry wood I'd collected earlier. I thanked God that I'd been smart enough to make a pile before sitting down for the night. The timber couldn't have been more than 10 feet away from me, but when I went to take a step towards the dry wood, my legs nearly gave out from under me. I was shaking bad. I heard the puppet begin to creak its way back up behind me. Maybe it noticed my fear. Maybe it knew I wasn't acting right. My intuition was flaring up in my mind like red-hot coals, that this thing wasn't just something I could run from. I had to play the game. Get the firewood. Don't acknowledge it. Just get the firewood. I straightened myself up and walked as casually as I could over to the bundle of fallen tree branches and limbs. I picked up a large handful and turned around. The marionette was standing just behind me, its coal-black eyes looking at my face. The clicking noise that was escaping its mouth sent a nearly uncontrollable fear through my body. But I pressed on. I walked in a straight line towards the fire pit, narrowly missing the wooden body of the doll. I took a knee to be near the warm flames and dropped the wood down next to me. Handful by handful, I placed the branches in the pit. The creaking of the doll had made its way over to my side as I stoked the flames. I glanced down at my thigh as the doll placed its thin, rotten hand against me. At that moment, I wanted to jump up and run away as far and as fast as I could, but instead I ignored that feeling. I ignored it as the tears welled up in my eyes. I took a stand near the fire and gathered my strength. I closed my eyes and took one last breath of night air before walking over to the tent. As soon as I walked into it, I zipped the door closed behind me. I saw the silhouette of the puppet standing right on the other side of the plastic sheeting, illuminated by the fire behind it. I finally cried. In hushed tones, I cried as long as I could remember. I went to look at my cell phone, let my brother know not to come down there, to tell him to go back to his car and get the conservation officer out here as soon as he could. But when I reached for my pocket, it hit me. I'd left my phone outside near the broken tree stump. I glanced back out at the shadow just outside my tent. It was facing me. It felt like it could see me through the thin layer of fabric that lay between us. I tried to gather up my courage to walk outside my tent and grab the phone, but I couldn't. I just sat there in my tent till I heard footsteps walking up to the campsite. "Hey, Jules, you up?" I stayed silent as Paul called out to me. "Sorry I'm late, but..." "What the hell is that?" he gasped. I heard the panic in Paul's voice. I watched the shadow as the puppet turned to face him. Its arms and legs jerked violently in the air. Paul turned as fast as he could and ran out of the clearing. The puppet followed him with impossible speed. It glided, its dangling, flailing limbs in the air as it began its chase. Not even a minute later, I heard a horrified yelp, then complete silence. I stayed in the tent all night, numb, broken, defeated. I just continually asked myself why I didn't say anything, why I didn't do anything. By the time morning came, I had left camp, picking up my phone and trying to dial Paul over and over again. There was never an answer. I left everything I brought in that exact spot. I never went back for it. I left those woods in a half daze that I've never recovered from. Before I knew it, I was back in the campground. I contacted the officers in charge of the area, and they conducted a search. They refused to listen to anything I had to say about what I'd seen. But the thing is, they didn't just dismiss it like I was crazy. It was like they'd already known what had happened and had refused to acknowledge it. We never found my brother. I could never take another walk in those woods either. I left the searching up to the police and the local volunteers. But what I can do is ask a question. Does anyone know anything about the old clickety-clackety story? If you read this, do not try to find me. She's in the shadows, watching with burning eyes, anywhere and everywhere. No matter how far I go or where I am, she's there, watching. I'll try to explain what happened. It started with a walk in the woods. I usually go there to clear my head, but this time was a bit different. Life has been difficult. My father, the only consistent figure in my life, passed away a few months before. My relationship with my girlfriend broke down. I was working as much as I could, but I could never keep up with my debt. Life was becoming a landslide, and I had the intention to end it. What better place than the woods? It was a beautiful day. I went for a walk with a backpack filled with rope and a pre-tied noose. I found a tree off the beaten path I could tie myself to. I expected a dog walker would find me at some point. They always seem to find the bodies. I was securing the noose to a branch when the puppy found me. I didn't recognize the breed. It had shaggy black fur with a faint silver ridge along the spine and beautiful, burning amber eyes. It looked at me and I felt ashamed. It seemed too young to be walking free in the woods, and it must have been lost. I untied the noose and climbed down from the tree. The pup stood waiting, its tail wagging. I knelt beside it and gave it a stroke of the head. It had no collar. He could have been lost or abandoned. "All right, boy, what are you doing out here?" I asked. He wagged his tail and licked my hand. There was some movement amongst the bushes. I called out to see if its owner was nearby, but got no response. The weather began to turn. Heavy gray clouds quickly filled the sky, and thunder rumbled through the trees. The air became thick with the storm energy. "We should get you somewhere safe," I decided, taking the pup back to my car. That was when I started noticing things were strange. The rain began to come down, drumming heavily on the car roof. The once beautiful day became dark. I decided to drive towards a vet I knew locally. If they couldn't take him in, they could surely suggest someone who would. They can check for a chip and maybe find the owners. I put the puppy in the passenger seat of my car. As I drove out of the car park, a flash of lightning showed something amongst the trees. A silhouette of a deer or a large dog, maybe, barely distinguishable from the shadows. I drove on. With the next lightning flash, the creature was closer, just off the side of the road. It could have been a man, or it was something four-legged but facing me. Two embers ignited in what could have been a pair of eyes. I didn't feel like waiting to find out what was watching me. I sped up and pulled out onto the main road. As I drove, the pup fidgeted in excitement, sniffing at the seat and playfully mouthing at my hand as I tried to hold him in place. I went to the vet only to find them closed. I searched my phone for dog rescue homes, but there was nothing nearby. "Looks like you're coming home with me, boy," I told him. I think he looked happy about that. Maybe I was projecting. Lightning flashed again. If I was going to take him home, I thought I'd better stock up on some food. It would require dipping into my overdraft, but at this point I didn't really care about anything but this dog. I stopped at my local shop and left him inside the car. At least I thought I did. While I was at the checkout buying a single tin of dog food and some treats, he appeared yapping at my feet. "You can't bring dogs in here," the miserable sleep-deprived shopkeeper snapped at me. I didn't. Sorry," I stumbled back. I scooped him up under my arm and went back to the car with my shopping. The door was locked. He must have snuck out before I shut the door. I was sure he was still inside when I locked it, though. I saw him through the window. I must have been wrong. I couldn't claim to be in the clearest state of mind, given my original plans for the day. I bundled him back in the car with the shopping. Despite not necessarily being a good boy, I told him that he was, and tore open the bag to invite him to a treat. I started my car, and there was another flash of lightning. It cast a shadow over the road where the thing stood watching me, eyes burning. It was getting closer, close enough to make me afraid. I floored it, pulling away from the shop and into the road without even looking, my tires spinning to find traction. I checked the rearview mirror as I sped away to see if the shadowy creature was giving chase, but I saw nothing. I looked forward, and with a flash of lightning, it was there in the middle of the road. Two eyes burning bright as fire hovered in the shadows of an old oak tree. The creature was at one with the darkness, appearing only in the shadow of the flickering lightning. In the brief moment of shadow, I could just make out faint wisps of eerie pale glow weaving through the void. My eyes were unable to make sense of the shapes. I jumped on the brakes, forcing the car behind me to screech to a halt. The puppy tumbled forward and into the footwell with a yelp. "What are you doing?" the driver shouted from behind me. I ignored him and helped the puppy back onto the seat. He wagged in excitement. I looked around for the beast, but there was no sign of it. The lightning had stopped. The rain was lightening now, and the dark clouds were rolling away as quickly as they came, letting the daylight through. The road before me was clear. The driver behind me sounded his horn. He didn't see anything. "You okay, boy?" I asked. He seemed unconcerned about anything that was happening in the world. "We should get home," I said. I drove through the town, wary of every shadow. Felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see whatever was watching me. Every flicker of light or patch of darkness put me on edge. Car headlights reflected off the wet road and cast images onto my mind. I began to doubt my sanity. I was heading home for shelter and safety, but I'd never felt safe there before. I lived in a room in a drafty old red brick Victorian house riddled with damp. I was overdue on rent to the landlady, Miss Whitaker, who was a harsh old woman hoarding money to take to the grave. She didn't allow noise or visitors, and she certainly didn't allow pets. Encountering her with the puppy in my arms was as terrifying as whatever was stalking me, because at least I knew Miss Whitaker was real. But there I was, the noose still in my backpack. I just needed to help out this dog before I could go back to my original plan. Why should I care about anything else? By the time I got home, the clouds had mostly parted, and we were getting the last of the afternoon sunshine. The daylight put me at some ease. I picked up the pup and its food and rushed into the house, hoping to get to the stairs before Miss Whitaker noticed me. Too slow. She appeared behind me in the gloomy hallway as I was halfway up the stairs. "Shouldn't you be at work?" she asked in a tone that was searching for a problem. "Day off," I replied without turning around, hoping she hadn't spotted the puppy. "Oh, I hope it's payday off. Rent is due," she said with suspicion. "Of course," I said, and continued walking upstairs. "What is that you've got there?" she asked. I turned to face her, resigned to revealing the puppy, but when I turned, the puppy wasn't in my arms. I looked around at the floor and saw no sign of it. Miss Whitaker had a ghostly appearance. Her gray hair and pale face were monochrome in the drab darkness of the hallway. She looked at me impatiently, and eventually I replied, "Nothing. It's just some shopping. Nothing too expensive, I hope. You need to pay my rent," she snapped. Then I saw it again. Behind Miss Whitaker in the shadows lurked the beast. Its flaming eyes drew up behind her. The shadow grew, almost submerging her in a shadowy void. For a moment, I hoped it would pull her in. Miss Whitaker said something, but I wasn't listening to her, concerned only with the specter in the shadows. I turned and rushed to the bottom of the stairs, but Miss Whitaker recoiled from me. I slapped at the light switch and the hallway brightened, the creature disappearing. Then I ran back up to my room. I slammed the door behind me and put the light on, then rushed over to the debris of dirty washing and litter to the window to pull the curtains open, exposing the remaining day to erase any darkness from the bedroom. I put the puppy on the floor and suddenly felt disgusted with myself. The room was filthy. Dirty dishes were stacked on the bedside table. Every surface was caked with dust. I could barely see the carpet for my mess. This wasn't a fit place for a dog to live. I had the immediate urge to tidy up. I cleaned a small space in the corner and emptied half the tin of dog food onto a clean bowl. While the puppy ate, I tidied up. Then I heard stomping up the stairs, Miss Whitaker shouting out, "What is wrong with you? Why have you put the lights on? That is my electricity you're wasting." She then banged on the door. "Have you got the lights on in there too? Open up." "Sorry, I just need some light. I'm tidying." "You? Ha!" This was the closest I had ever come to hearing her laugh. "Turn it off now, or you can move out. Please, just leave me alone for a bit." She banged on the door again. "Off, now." When she noticed the light remains on, she said, "Fine, I'll sort it myself," and stomped back downstairs. The puppy was eating happily. I found a half-full bottle of water and emptied it into a small dish for him to drink. I watched him while sitting on the edge of my bed. Then the puppy had his fill and came over to sit by my feet. I lifted him onto the bed, and he got comfortable, resting his head on my thigh as his amber eyes looked up at me. He began to sleep as I stroked the top of his head, and it seemed at that moment we were both content. Then the lights went out. Miss Whitaker must have switched my electricity off at the fuse box. The fading daylight from outside the window was not enough to extinguish the shadows in the corner by the wardrobe. Flaming eyes slowly appeared from nowhere, as if the darkness was a doorway. The monster was in my room. I picked up the puppy and edged away along the bed. Soon my back was against the wall and I had nowhere else to go. The fiery eyes grew closer. Ethereal wisps danced from the darkness until my eyes could finally make sense of their shape and movement. I could see a vague outline of 4 limbs walking, hackles raised down its back. A muzzle snarled at me, dripping with drool. The great hound became clearer beyond its spectral hue, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. It had a pale streak down its back like the puppy. It padded beyond the shadow to show thick, shaggy black fur. It was ready to pounce at any minute. It gave a guttural growl, exposing great white fangs. While I recoiled helplessly, the puppy squirmed free and clambered down my leg to the floor, the ridge of pale fur down its back showing white with ethereal light. It ran over to the great black beast, which never broke its gaze away from me. Then, as if breaking from a trance, it looked down at the pup, lowering its snout towards it. "No!" I shouted. I couldn't let it devour the helpless thing. "No!" I shouted again. I picked up the lamp from my bedside table in a pathetic attempt to brandish any sort of weapon. The beast looked at me with contempt, then looked back down at the puppy. It lowered its snout and licked it across its face. The puppy brushed up against the monster and wagged its tail. The great hound inspected the pup with sniffs and licks of maternal care. The mother then picked the puppy up by the scruff of the neck, and they walked into the shadow, fading into wisps of spectral light before disappearing. The puppy appears every so often to play, no matter where I am, home, work, even when I was in the police interview room. The mother is never far away. They usually disappear back into the shadows before anyone else can see them. Usually, those who have seen them don't live long to tell about it. I know they think they're protecting me, but they didn't need to kill Mrs. Whitaker. I didn't notice for a few days until the smell crept through the floorboards. At her door, I heard the buzzing of flies. I called the police to break into her room, and they found her mauled. The coroner ruled that it was a dog attack, although they couldn't explain how a dog got in and out of the locked room. The mother never fully comes out of the shadows, but she watches me. In the corner of my eye, I'll catch its fiery gaze. I don't think she means me harm, but I've seen what she can do, and it's hard not to be afraid. The pup is a good boy, but they're both overprotective. I've seen their eyes appear whenever anyone angers or upsets me. I know she intends to kill them. Death seems like nothing to her. My supervisor at work was found dead in the stockroom after he criticized the time I had taken off due to my mental health. I admit it got to me. He was mauled like Mrs. Whitaker. The hound also appeared after my ex-girlfriend came over and demanded her TV back. She forced her way in, and I was desperate for her to leave, so I ended up giving it to her. But it wasn't about the TV. She was just insistent on arguing. She didn't make it out of the house. I tried to stop them. After the deaths, I had to run. I'm innocent, I swear it, but if the police turn up to arrest me, I can't imagine what the hounds would do to them. I found somewhere secluded to live. I won't say where, but it seems mostly safe, and I'm content with a simple life off the grid. I have had occasional troubles. Some men tried to break into the caravan where I've been staying. That didn't last long. I had to bury their bodies in a ditch one night. The dogs were just protecting me. At least I'm not suicidal anymore. What does that say about me, that I'm willing to live even when I'm such a risk to others? As long as people leave me alone, they'll be safe. I can't control what comes from the shadows. All I ever wanted was for my wife and I to live comfortably. But the longer we stayed together, the higher our bills became. We'd already fought off debt from college, barely scraping by. Even after we paid them off, we were only able to afford a tiny apartment on the outskirts of New York. Sidewalks laid cracked everywhere, while finely condemned buildings sat sadly against their crooked foundations. Crooked lampposts that hang only by electrical wires. Graffiti marked every street corner, and bland art that existed without rhyme or reason. Homeless people could be found on every street corner, a constant reminder of what would happen to my wife and I if I failed to keep up with our payments. However, I managed to make somewhat decent money as a plumber, but even then, it sometimes wasn't enough to deal with the loan sharks, the hefty utility bills, the food prices, and gas money. I was willing to do anything to get us out of there. And that is where I encountered gambling. I was willing to take the risk. I'd take any chance to obtain a reward, even just a small one. It started out with a handful of poker games. Then I moved on to scratch tickets and slot machines. All I needed was enough to get by. Unfortunately, obtaining a payday from the casinos was impossible. I started growing desperate, which only led to more debt. The whole cycle sucked me down like Odysseus' ship into Charybdis' maw. Just like that, my relationship with my wife began to tear apart. My wife and I were once so close. Before we married, there would be days that we'd work together at the wood shop, creating 3D prints of various sci-fi characters in video games. Other times we'd study the components of circuits and use them to create elaborate lighting displays whenever Christmas arrived. Our wedding day was supposed to be the greatest day of our lives. Instead of relying on the help of others, like we did back in college, we relied on ourselves. But my actions tore all that apart. I didn't know what else to do either. A few nights ago, I arrived at my apartment, having completed a 10-hour shift fixing drains of several upper-class tenements. I rested my hand on the knob, expecting the worst from my wife. Sighing, I pushed the door open. The moment I did, she was already in the front hall. Her eyes were scrunched, and she was holding a bank statement, smacking it for emphasis. "Care to explain?" she demanded. I rubbed my temples, removing my scum-covered overalls and plopping them right into the nearest laundry hamper. We locked eyes. Breaking eye contact with her would only ignite her anger further. She was holding another piece of evidence of my failure to strike it rich. All I could do was stand there sheepishly, tail tucked behind me, and wait to get ripped a new one. No words would come out of my mouth. She marched up to me, holding it in my face. "Frank, you wasted $3,000 at the casino again, didn't you?" my wife bellowed. I set my toolbox down and washed the pipe gunk off my hands, looking down for just a bit. "Turn around and look me in the eye." Resting a hand on my eyes, I glanced over her petite frame. Then I began to speak. We can live comfortably if you just give... Enough of your excuses. We nearly lost our apartment twice from all the betting on the slots. You wasted our heating money on roulette. And now this. The landlord wants $4,000 in 2 weeks. And if we can't get it sorted out, we're going to lose our apartment. I held up my hand reassuringly. Look, just let me figure this out. I'll think of some way to get money. You better, otherwise we're getting a divorce. You got it? Without another word, I put on a casual outfit and exited for some fresh air, shutting the door behind me. I gazed back at the unpolished apartment number on the frame. Wincing, I clenched a fist and descended the rickety stairs. Eventually, my boots hit the cracked pavement and I headed off. I stood outside a graffiti-covered subway station, pacing around, hands in my pockets. My fists constricted as I pounded a nearby wall. There's no way I could have been able to make that kind of money. Craps were too unpredictable, arcade machines were always rigged, and roulette was too high in stakes. Seeing red, I screamed and kicked a wall as hard as I could. My foot throbbed, and once I was done with my fit, I broke down sobbing. The sidewalk darkened with my tears. I pressed my head against it, clawing at it until my fingernails turned crimson. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder. Wiping my tears away, I glanced over. A card was lying on the floor. Its borders were covered in green dollar symbols. The rest of the card was a silver color, shiny enough to reflect my face in it. Written in gold letters were the following: Aces High Casino. Win 1 round of blackjack and earn $50 million. No monetary wager needed. Table 777. My eyes lit up. All I had to do was win 1 game of blackjack and I'd be rich. Dimples formed at the corners of my cheeks and I pumped my fist. I nearly clicked my heels in joy, but I decided against it. I'd already caused enough of a scene already, and I wanted to make sure nobody knew my secret. When I flipped it around, it had an address also written in gold letters. Despite the address being in an unknown area, I still managed to pull it up on my phone's maps and arrive without much struggle. The casino itself was a pigsty, to say the least. Smokers polluted the air and the prison-gray interior. Slot machines with broken lights clicked and whirred while cheap dice clattered against tables with peeling felt. Meanwhile, the concrete floor was covered in colonies of roaches while neglected beer bottles sat against the rugs of several tables. The only thing that was well kept was the bar and a room draped with navy blue curtains and gold sashes. Emblazoned over the doorway was the number 777. This was the first time I'd entered a casino smiling. For once, I thought this was my lucky night. When I pushed the curtain away, they revealed a room with an ornamented black wallpaper, an assortment of oak desks, and other furniture. The walls were covered in fine Baroque paintings. On the floor was a single blue carpet covered in opulent tapestries. I followed the back wall to a single dealer table coated in green felt. 2 seats were present, with one person taking the seat on the left. He was shaking with what I assumed then was excitement. Behind him was a dealer, a trim man with blonde hair and a top hat over his nose and eyes. He wore a dapper tuxedo free of blemishes that shimmered in the light of a single hanging gas lamp. His skin was pure, free of moles, glistening with a slight amount of glitter. "Why, hello there," the man spoke, his voice slicker than the gel in his hair. "Are you here to win big?" Unlike the loan sharks, his teeth were cleaner than a freshly washed plate. "Yup, deal me in," I said, straightening my back, shuffling into the last seat. The other player had his jaw locked together. His eyes were drooping and bloodshot. Sweat pooled around his brow like glass beads. Just like him, I always felt nervous about losing, so their reactions were understandable. "You know the rules of blackjack. I deal out cards. You say hit me if you want more cards. Get closest to 21 without going over. Dealer only draws 2 cards, and you can also surrender your cards for half your bet. When you don't want any more cards, say the word stand," the dealer said, shuffling his cards through his hands and manipulating them like a sculptor with a ceramic pot. I double blinked. Wager? What do I bet with? Play a game, and I'll tell you. The mystery man focused on passing out the cards. First, he brought out 2 cards for himself and dealt 2 more to each player. Instantly, he flipped over his cards. Jack King. 20. I clutched the velvet black card, seeing what I was dealt. A 10 and a 7 of hearts. I forced my face into a neutral smile. My stomach twisted. There was no way I could get 21 that easily. Surrender, I said, pushing my cards to the dealer. All he did was shuffle the cards and toss me 2 more. They didn't even bother looking up at me during the process. The other players started clutching his stomach. His smile vanished. I carefully looked over the guy's cards. 7 and a 2 of clubs. Hit me, the guy on the left choked out. An ace of spades. Total of 10. Sweat trickled down his head like a shower in April. His eyes welled up with tears, while foam developed in the corners of his mouth. I raised an eyebrow, wondering what his deal was. I knew the stakes of gambling, but my sixth sense was telling me something was just not right here. No, that couldn't be true. Even if there was some kind of string attached or fine print I didn't read, I couldn't risk giving up on that kind of money. Besides, this might have been my only chance to obtain such a vast reward without much risk. Hit me, the man wheezed. 5 of hearts. His teeth chattered. While I waited for my turn, I stood up and walked around the room, getting a closer look at all the ornate gadgets and such. My eyes focused on a painting on the leftmost wall. It resembled a man in a rich military regalia, but something made my hair stand on end. His upturned white mustache looked damp, and his face sagged like they were crying. Linear, stick-like shadows were cast on the sleeves. Edging forward, they came into focus. Hands. I followed their form outward, which extended into oily, dripping arms. Shh! A faint noise echoed from somewhere in the room. What? I mouthed, turning an ear to the source. Shh! It came from the painting. I backed away, hands at my side. Was someone dragged into that painting? Where are you going? You forgot to pay up, the dealer yelled back, hands slamming on the table and pulling out a sack of navy blue poker chips. I double-took. I thought the card said that no monetary wager was needed. There isn't. Then I looked at the ground. There was a second rug on the ground. The tapestry matched, but its pattern didn't match with the other rug. It was off-center from the rest of the decorations, like someone didn't even bother setting it up properly. Taking a closer look, I could hear faint whispers coming from it too. When I looked back up, the guy on the left was gone. I rushed over, checking his cards. A total of 25. Swallowing saliva, I stood in confusion, wondering what to do next. I scraped my fingernails against my palm. I needed that money. If I didn't get it, I'd lose my wife and my apartment. And what about loan sharks? Only God knew what would happen to me if I didn't pay up. What was I going to do? What would happen if I lost? Would I turn into another object, just like the other guy? Or would it be a worse fate than that? That's because there isn't a monetary wager. I'm still taking half of what you owe. In my game, your payment is in pain. A sharp stab punched my left side. It felt heavier than before, like my veins were replaced with tungsten. I grabbed my fingers around my chest. The area around the pain almost felt like a tumor. Brushing around the area, I could make out a cylindrical mass. I tried to inspect it some more, but the pain overwhelmed me, and I crumpled to the ground. I crouched down on all fours, trying to get back to my seat, but the pain froze me in place. Reaching out a hand, I called out for help, but I got nothing. Slithering away, I pulled back the curtain to the entrance of the casino. I spat on the ground from the bludgeoning pain. Don't feel out of luck? You can still surrender once more and have 2 chances left, the dealer smiled, adjusting his hat. It was only a glimpse, but I caught a look at his upper face. His eyes were on his hat, and his forehead was blank. The dealer looked plucked straight out of an Alice in Wonderland book. What or who was this guy? Think long and hard about it. I saw you arguing with your wife. I clambered back to my seat. I still didn't know what the dealer did to me. Something in me forced me to get back up and keep playing. More questions ate at me the longer I played. How did he know that information? Then I remembered feeling a tap on the back at Grand Central Station. The card that brought me here. He couldn't have been human. Was he some kind of demon? I didn't bother asking. There wasn't any way he would spill the beans about his nature anyway. After what seemed like hours, I managed to writhe back to my seat, slumping over the table like I'd just had the worst hangover. Ready to try again? The charming man said, resting his chin on his interlocking hands. Reluctantly, I gave him a thumbs up. He took back the cards and began manipulating the deck again. I analyzed every move he made. None of the cards were tricked. He wasn't second dealing, and he didn't have any aces up his sleeve. Never revealing anything under the table either. His honesty was the only thing that brought me any reassurance. Still, keeping an eye out was critical. The dealer revealed his cards. 2 tens again, 1 of spades and 1 of hearts. His face was harder than diamonds and glowing like one, too. Not a pleasing glow, but one that vexed anyone that dared to glare at it. I looked at my cards, an ace and a 7, 18. Gripping my lower abdomen, I stayed crumpled in agony. The odds of getting a blackjack were slim, and stabbing pain skewed my thoughts. Surrender, I wheezed. The words slipped out of my mouth like a dying breath of a wounded soldier. The dealer smiled, holding a pile of blue poker chips around him. He waved his hand over the mound and made an inaudible chant. Then they vanished. I held my hands over my face, bracing myself. Suddenly the pain doubled, shifting to my right like a mudslide down a hill. Now I knew everything the previous player was going through. I vomited out something hard and blue. It was a poker chip. Suddenly my guts turned and another 7 spilled out. My esophagus wound itself into knots, more contorted than cobwebs. I forfeit. The man started to smile. Without these? With a thud, the hat-faced dealer pulled out a jar filled with a kidney and a piece of liver. They still oozed with blood that pumped and fit their containers. I remembered how the dealer said that there was no monetary wager. He never said there wasn't a wager at all, though. I paid in pain, and my wager was my organs. You want them back? Then win them. He set them back on the ground. Now there was no choice. My fate was sealed if I tried to leave. I started to shed tears. If I didn't get those organs back and fast, I was done for. Even if someone saw me passed out on the floor, finding donors for organs wasn't guaranteed. And even then, it had just put me further in debt. Nothing would be solved. Then again, was trying to beat this guy even worth it? No, the reward was too great. Taking a deep breath, I sat back down. Reluctantly, I asked that he proceed. The dealer drew out cards like before. He took the cards and gave them a good shuffle. Plucking 2 cards out of the stack, he revealed them. A king and a 9. Another poker chip tumbled up my throat. I spat it out, red and blue plastic heaping together. Not paying attention to the mess I made, he handed me 2 cards. A jack and a 2. A 12. Hit me. An ace. An ace could count as 1 or 11, depending on what other cards were drawn. Still had a fighting chance. Hit me. A 5. His dead stare tore at my soul. I scratched against the felt, the wounds on my finger reopening. From the corner of my eye, I could see him frowning. "Are you going to play, or do you want all that money to go to waste?" "Shut up," I said through gritted teeth. "Hit me." I watched the dealer play out the last card. A queen. "You lose," the dealer said coldly, grabbing a pile of poker chips and holding them close. He waved his hands over the mound and made another incantation. Then they vanished once more. Everywhere at once, burning pain seared my skin, making me black out. When I woke up, felt my arms, they were covered in something hard and blue and plastic. The clothes were gone. I examined my extremities and my torso. My skin was missing, replaced with poker chips. They were shaped to fit every part. Cracks filled with blood gushed out with every slight movement I made. Horrified, I spilled my guts. More poker chips slid out of my throat. Piles of skin laid clumped to the side of the table in hideous pink and blood-red sheets. "I think you know what's at stake now. One try left. You better make it count, unless you want to end up as an object for all eternity." The rigidity of my plastic-coated skin made every movement expose more and more cracks, searing my muscles. I groaned as I raised myself up. Crimson liquid dampened the table. I pounded at it. This was it. I either walked out of here with my money and saved my marriage, or I lost and suffered a fate worse than death. Giving up was not an option. I gave the mysterious man a death glare, not even bothered by his resistance. He plucked out 2 cards, a 9 and a 10. This was my chance. Then my cards were revealed, a 10 and a 2. Fingers rattling, I took a deep breath and let the calmness seep into me. "Hit me," I sputtered. Another 2. Huffing, I opened my mouth to speak again. The dealer just stared at me, tilting his head like a vulture waiting for roadkill. The poker chips rattled again, grinding against each other. "Hit." I paused for a moment, collecting my thoughts. At a value of 14, I needed at least a 6 to beat the dealer, but an 8 or higher would result in disaster. Gulping down another chaser of saliva, I spoke. "Hit me." To my chagrin, a 5 slipped out of the hand. I was now tied. Staring at the pile of skin and my other organs, I closed my eyes and shook in horror. An ace or a 2 were the only cards I could draw in order to win. I looked down at my cards, sweat dripping on the table. With a quick glance, I gazed at the eyes on the man's silk hat. "Don't keep me waiting," the man demanded. I'd begun to hyperventilate. His stare grew more intense the longer I waited. His confident smile turned into a frown of irritation. Eyebrows and mouth were twisted into a hideous snarl. He rattled his fingers against the dealer's table. The cacophony made my ears go numb. Then I whispered, "Hit me." The man darted up, smiling back in anticipation. "I'm sorry, what was that?" I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. "Hit me!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. Then, the last card was revealed. A 2. I'd won. My mouth dropped open. The sheet of skin unfurled themselves and flattened over me. 2 organ jars spilled over, their contents rising in a beam of white and torpedoing back into my body. Immediately, I yelped at the top of my lungs, clicking my heels and doing a little jig. I regained my strength, instantly looking around for traces of my prize. For several minutes, I wasn't able to uncover anything. Staring directly at the dealer's face, I asked him to reveal the prize. "I don't have it with me," he said blankly. Not listening, I scrutinized every inch of the room, looking beyond his station, checking under the table, everywhere. I searched everywhere for my prize, my happiness dissipating. With each step I took, my smile faded even further, twisting into a frown. My nose crinkled. "Where's my 50 mil?" I demanded, overturning the table. ripping off the ornate paintings and yanking the tasseled rugs off the floor. You promised me 50 mil if I beat you. Do you realize what's going to happen to me if I don't get that money, you charlatan? The strange man just stood there, not even acknowledging my plea. You promised me money. You're a thief, I roared, pointing an accusing finger at him. I only did this for my wife, to save my marriage. I almost gave up my life trying to help my family out. You can't take that away from me. The demon stuck his hands behind his back and shook his head. He rolled his eyes back in thought. Something was up with him. You aren't like the other gamblers, he said. What other gamblers? I said, looking back. They all wanted the money for worthless things. A mansion with fountains and a view, hookers, a trip to Tahiti. He paced around me, his face rather relaxed and calm. Never once did he lose eye contact with me. But you had such determination to help your family that you would risk everything. I admire that. It took me a while, but I figured out that you're actually a kind-hearted person. I saw red and tried to punch him. He grabbed my wrist, shoving it back. Listen to me. I understand your rage. There never was a prize in the first place. It was nothing but a lure to capture those that wasted their lives away. But there's one thing you don't understand. I thrust my hand back. I understand you nearly killed me for nothing. Yes, but that was before I saw you the way you really were. Listen to my words. Slowly I relaxed my posture, but I remained firm. Why should I listen to you? I can help you out of your situation. You owe me money, you snake, I said, my nostrils flaring. You never needed the money in the first place. Taken aback, I retreated. What do you mean? I said. My arms relaxed once more. You're a plumber, aren't you? I saw you come home from work. I also caught a look at your schedule. 40 hours a week for $38 an hour for 5 days a week. That's $36,000 a week for 2 weeks. You already have everything you need. But you don't understand. They need $4,000, I pleaded. He wouldn't budge. Trying to earn this money via dumb risks and chance will not get you anything. Look at all the things you've done wrong. And I want to change that, I said, wiping my eyes as they began to tear. But what am I supposed to do now? The only way you can earn that money is through grit and spit, he said, walking around me. You aren't going to find solace through good luck alone, and you already have the tools that some people don't. If you give up now, you might as well have lost. Think about it. With those last words, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers, disappearing without a trace. Slowly, I gathered my things and walked out of the casino, head hanging low. The next day, I was fixing an old lady's faucet, inspecting the leak. I wondered what the demon's words had meant. Before I stuck the wrench up to the U-trap, I remembered my pay. If I worked the same amount of hours as before, I'd only make $3,600. But if I pulled off some overtime and worked several extra hours, I might just be able to pay off the debt. I started staying up much later than before. Not long after, my wife started becoming suspicious. Eventually, she confronted me. Frank, you've been staying up late. You going back to the casinos again? She asked, hands on her hips. I closed my eyes, and instead of fear, calmness filled my veins, and my blood stilled. Not this time. I've been putting in some overtime. Her face loosened up for just a moment before hardening again. I held my hands up and motioned my palms downward. Listen, I've been horrible lately. All my gambling did was drown us deeper in debt. Her expression began to soften up again, her frown vanishing. I want to change things. We used to work so well together, doing everything to help each other. Instead of fighting against each other, it's time we made our peace, and we bring us out of debt together. I held my hand out for her to shake. She kept her arm pulled back and folded like a pincer of a mantis. Inch by inch, though, she extended it and took my hand. The following day, my wife convinced me to go to therapy and get out of my addiction, which I gladly obliged. Simultaneously, she decided to start up another job working as an electrician. Day by day passed, and we pooled our resources as one. Before our eyes, bills were paid, and debt disappeared faster than our eye floaters. Our financial status wasn't the only thing that changed. Her once crusty mood lightened up, and she began to smile more. She began to believe my words and began to respect the changes I made. And then we paid off our rent. We got a letter from our landlord saying that we now were even. The moment that letter came in, we embraced each other. The only question now was, what were we going to do with the extra money? Not long ago, we ended up earning enough to create our own 3D project, this time of a companion cube. Day after day, we create more projects. Although we weren't as happy as our days back in college, we still could make the best of what we had. In retrospect, the hat-faced man put up a good fight, but I managed to come out of the casino with more than I'd gone in with. It wasn't exactly money, but it wasn't worthless either. I always wanted to be a writer, ever since I was in second grade. Over the course of my life, I got pretty good at it. Even got to the point where companies were paying me large salaries to take their ideas and turn them into stories and ad campaigns. By the time I was 30, I generated millions of dollars, spun up a portfolio that could land me any job, and made a name for myself in professional writing circles. But there was one thing I was missing: the ability to come up with good ideas. Now, you may think that in my position, that didn't matter much. Companies gave me the ideas. I brought them to life, and I made a lot of money doing it. Why did my lack of ideas really matter? They mattered because money didn't matter to me. Ideas did. I didn't want to be a professional writer. I wanted to be a creative one. I wanted to tell stories that chilled my readers, turned their stomach, broke their hearts. I wanted to create characters that men secretly cried over, and women openly lusted over in their book clubs. I wanted to paint settings that kept children up at night and drove movie producers crazy. I wanted to be the best storyteller. The only way to do that was to come up with winning ideas. But I didn't have any, so I looked for them in prompt workbooks. I even stole them from other authors' stories. I went to the workshops and watched as my peers spent their time while I stared at blank papers and laptop screens. Nothing worked. My ideas were either soft and boring or unrealistic and uncompelling. Nothing that I conceived begged to be brought to life on the page, and when I forced them out, they always seemed to droop over as if they were empty bags without skeletons or muscles. They were husks without any of the human stuff that held a real person up. Unlike me, they didn't even have the disappointment or self-pity to stand on their own. I was 35 when my pathetic inability to come up with ideas finally overwhelmed me. I didn't remember exactly what caused it, but I was on my way home from yet another writing workshop with the local Writers Guild when I decided that my life had grown meaningless. I was going home to craft a story, and if I couldn't do it, I was going to take my own life. That, I decided, was at least a creative story that someone would remember. You might suspect that the ultimatum gave me a sense of fear, but for the first time in my life, something clicked. There were stakes, and I felt the strange brush of a story pass over me, gently hitting my cheek with its tail. It was gone before I could grab it, but once again, for the first time, I knew that it would come back. It had responded to the stakes. I sped the rest of the way home, eager and gleeful to see which way the story would unfold. Would the hero pass the test, or would he fall into darkness? I didn't know. I couldn't wait to find out. I nearly knocked down my front door in a rush to get to my desk. I didn't even bother to turn on any lights as I thundered upstairs and down the hall to my bedroom, all the way in the back. I even tripped over my cat, who was so startled by the change in my normally lethargic state that he was caught in a panic trying to figure out which way to run. Once I was in my bedroom, I lit a candle, opened my laptop, and felt all the momentum drain from the tip of my fingers. What was I going to write about? I hadn't had a single idea on my way home, but I'd felt them swimming around. They'd called out to me again and again, "Come to me, take me, expose me to the world." For the first time, they wanted me, but they were teasing little things, and now that it was time to get to business, they were hiding. It didn't bother me, though. I'd heard the whole spiel before. You had to start writing, and the story would come. So that's what I did, and they did start to come. I could feel them again, little threads brushing my cheeks, my arms, my hands, but I couldn't see them. They kept hiding just beyond the veil of reality. I could almost hear them laughing at me like little sprites, making childish bets among themselves about how long I would keep trying until I gave up for the last time. Well, I wasn't going to give up. I decided with a huff, but suddenly the stakes didn't feel so thrilling anymore. Instead, the reality of what I'd promised inflated in front of me, and I realized that I was going to tell a story one way or another, and I didn't want to tell the story I'd leveraged as collateral. But I didn't have a different story to tell, and I wasn't sure how long it would take me to make one, if I was even capable. But that didn't really matter, did it? This was going to end, one of two ways. I drummed my fingers on the desk for a while. Then I typed in random keys until I had a page full of J3R, 3R, 9S, and other random characters. But that didn't turn into a story, so I opted for a classic, Once Upon a Time. What came after that? I wasn't sure. I kept fidgeting with different things on my desk until my candle started to sputter, and I looked up to find that the wick was drowning in melted wax. I'd been sitting here wrestling with my ideas for hours, and all I had was a page full of random letters and numbers. I put my hands on my knees, preparing to stand up. Then I remembered my ultimatum. I wasn't ready for that yet. I'd felt the idea swimming by just hours earlier in the car. This was my chance to pin them down, and I wasn't about to get up, no matter how bored or hungry or thirsty or hopeless I felt. Plus, I didn't particularly want to die. I'd just said it because it felt story-like, and I hoped it would kickstart my creativity. With that in mind, I settled back down and tried to start my first sentence. I wrote, deleted, wrote again until I lost count. Finally, I had a first sentence when my eyes were starting to seriously droop, and the yawn became more and more frequent. I looked at my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, far past my bedtime, but I was starting to feel it again, the wisp of a story thread brushing my cheek. I had a first sentence, and it was time to get to work. I kept writing. The progress was faster than ever before. By 4 a.m. I had 2 pages. By 5 I had half of another. But by 5:15 I was starting to slow down. My head was bobbing back and forth, and every few minutes I would wake up, surprised that I'd fallen asleep. I tried my best to look at the screen, but it was blurry. So blurry that I couldn't even read the words. It was time to go to sleep. I stood up and my legs gave out, sending me elbow first onto my desk. But I didn't feel it. The only thing I felt was joy. I'd done it. I had an idea. By this time, I didn't even know what it was about anymore, but I had an idea. I stumbled back down the hallway to the kitchen to get a glass of water. My cat protested loudly. He might have been hungry, but I couldn't really tell. I'd kept my door closed the entire time I'd been writing, so I hadn't seen him much. In the kitchen, I filled a glass of water and was halfway through gulping it down when I froze, letting the rest dump down my chest. "Peekaboo," slithered a dark, playful voice from the shape that had frozen mid-gulp. "Giving up so soon, are you?" I stared back at the 2 shining eyes, the only indication that something had been sitting on the couch in the first place. The shape stood and walked towards me, with a slow, deliberate pace. The next great American author, standing in his kitchen, a brilliant book sitting on his screen, just waiting to be finished, but he's ready to call it quits. By now, the figure was on the edge of the shadowed, carpeted square that made up my living room. He took another step, exposing a long, thin, suited leg. "Ah, it's 'cause you don't remember me, do you?" With that, the figure stepped out into the slat of gray morning light, making its way into the kitchen by the window. I stumbled backwards at the sight, but There wasn't far to go. My back was already against the sink. The thing that stepped out was no man, though that was the closest description anyone would have given. It was tall and skinny, almost to a sickly point. It wore a suit that was at least one size too big, so that the shoulders were too wide, the jacket too baggy, the sleeves too long, and the pants fell in rolls of fabric at his shoes. The only thing remotely normal about it was its face, which had the uncanny look of someone who could only be human, but on the very verge of being called so. It had a sharply contrasted jawline, huge cheekbones, overly tight lips, and sharp, bright eyes. Besides the thin, stringy hair that fell over its shoulders in unkempt, flat locks, the smile was the most memorable feature. It was a smart smile, devious and genuinely malicious, the kind of smile you'd see before someone completely innocent gets unfixedly hurt. "How are you gonna do it, Nathan? I've been sitting on the couch, brimming with ideas." "Oh, I'm sorry. Was that insensitive? What I mean is that you have options. You're clearly ready to exercise them, since you're in here. Come, sit down with me and we'll talk them out. I'm thinking grand." It gestured with a long, outstretched arm, motioning as if it wanted to put its arms around me and guide me like a friend. "Remember, this is your story moment." By this point, I had already backed myself onto the corner without realizing it, and now I must have looked like I was trying to pack myself into one of the cabinets. "Nathan," it started again, taking another step forward. Forgive me. My manners astound me sometimes. I didn't introduce myself." It bit its bottom lip and flashed its same grin. "My name is Promise." I leapt back down from the counter and sprinted down the hallway, where I threw the door closed and jumped onto my bed. Promise's chuckle echoed down the hallway. "I guess you're gonna keep working on that story, huh?" it called after me. I was nearly hyperventilating when I sat down at my desk again, but at least my eyes weren't blurry anymore. My mind and body were wide awake, although I wasn't entirely sure what had just happened was real. But what else could it have been? I asked myself sharply. Something was in my house. Something had been sitting on my couch, mocking me. Something that wasn't entirely human had just introduced itself to me. And it knew about my ultimatum, my promise. I breathed out, putting my face in my palms. It knew about my promise. I sat there with my head in my hands for a few minutes before I calmed down enough to think. I had two options: finish my story or run. I wasn't sure that running would help, so I slid off the bed and walked back over to my desk. I scrolled back up to the top of the page and started to read so I could get back on track. As soon as I started, a guttering emptiness spread from my stomach to my throat. The story that I'd been working on for nearly 12 hours was awful. The core idea, exploring the daily life of a man who's haunted by his childhood emotional neglect, was boring. The entire 3 pages were nothing but me spinning my wheels, writing about a man whose life was so dull that no one would want to read him anyway. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt the breathless weight of fear. Promise was waiting. Promise was eager for me to come out again, because he must know. He must know that my story was flat. He must know that my character was lifeless. He must know that I had no story kernel or any other idea that the other writers were always seeming to have. He could probably read my story right now, I thought with wild certainty. And it was no longer curiosity or creativity that drove me to my keyboard. Instead, it was wild desperation. In one move, I selected all the text and deleted it. When I tried to settle in, my breath was too heavy, and I could feel it. I knew he was there. Whether he was sitting on the couch or leaning against the door, I knew he was there. All I knew was he could hear the click-clack of the keys and the bang-bang of my heart. I was sure he could even hear my thoughts, and so I screamed as loud as I could in my head, "Not done, not done, not done," until my inner ear felt like it was bleeding and blunted. And then I was exhausted again. No energy, no ideas, just an ever-dulling knowledge that I had to finish this story. That's when I saw them. I looked down at the clock in the corner of my screen to check the time before getting back to work. It was 7:42. Morning sunlight was dancing through my window, and it caught something and sent a dazzling rainbow all around the room. It was gone in a moment, but I turned all around to look for it, and found it circling my head in wispy motions. A translucent butterfly with long threads hanging at the ends of its wings. As it flew around my head, the threads tickled my cheek, and I gasped. For the first time all night, it was my turn to smile. I'd made it through the night and been rewarded. An idea had graced me, a sacred muse in the form of a butterfly. My smile grew, and suddenly there were more flashes of light, more and more swimming in the air, catching the sunlight and sending dazzling refracted rainbows of light all around the room, directly into my eyes. So, this was what it was like. So many of them at once, at least 50 ideas kissing my head with their threads. I'd waited my entire life. I'd prayed for this, sacrificed for this, but clearly I'd never sacrificed enough. Whoever'd been listening had needed more to send me a muse, and my life and the balance had been enough. I was ready, so I reached out and cupped my hand around the random butterfly, breathing deeply of its golden light, ready for ideas to flow through my nostrils and into my soul. But the moment I touched it, the butterfly disappeared as if it had never been. I sat back, shocked, then I inched my hands towards each other, ready to cup it and breathe it in, but it also disappeared as if it had never existed. I tried a third, and then, getting desperate, I tried to pluck a fourth out of the air. Both disappeared as soon as I touched them. Hot, heavy rage rose in my stomach. I plucked at another, and it was gone. I swung my head forward and tried to breathe in the group, but all I met was empty air. I slammed my hands together over a solitary tenth and opened them to find nothing but stinging red skin. Every time they disappeared in front of me, the butterflies would appear again in my peripheral vision, and they would multiply. Eventually, it became more detrimental to try to catch them, and I dropped into my chair and looked at my screen. By then, I could barely look at it for all the bright butterflies circling my head. But I had to. I hadn't forgotten who was out there, waiting in the shadows of the curtains I'd left drawn over the windows. I went on working like this for another 12 hours. I had to squint at my screen just to see, and I wrote and deleted more times than I could count. Eventually I started drifting off, and by 12 p.m. my eyes were screaming for a break, my bladder crying for relief, and my parched throat felt like it cracked with every breath. But I couldn't step outside the room until it was done. So I stood up and danced with the butterflies. I couldn't touch them, but at least dancing would show them I cared. I stumbled back and forth across the floor, falling into the vase I kept by my desk and sending it shattering to the carpet. I had an incredible deep shattering noise as pieces of porcelain rocketed across the room. My eyes must have grown as wide as the windows. At least that's how they felt to me, because it was perfect. It was perfect for my story. I rushed through the broken mess back to my desk and slammed myself into the seat. I pressed enter on the keyboard and started typing my next line. I wasn't exactly sure what the story was about, but I was certain this was the one. I opened my eyes and the butterflies were gone. I sat up straight, drawing in breath sharply as I looked at the clock. 12:07. I'd accidentally slept for 7 minutes. Incensed, I balled up my fists and hit myself in the head. Stupid. I had work to do. I had to stay awake. If I went for long enough without working, he would... I saw his eyes looking in through the cracked door and watched as his emotionless face erupted in a grin. "Quitting time?" he asked, poking a finger through the door. I pushed myself out of the side of my chair and fell tailbone first on the floor. "Don't worry, Nathan. I'm just checking on you. I heard that awful crash, and then there was silence. I was beginning to think something might have happened to you. I couldn't let that happen. That's my job. But you have to make the call. Though, guessing by how long you've been in here at this, I don't think there's much time left. Maybe I should wait close by." He pushed the door the rest of the way open with his pointed finger and strolled into the room, crunching the remaining vase shards under his shoeless feet. He sat down on the bed, sat with his feet crossed like a child, and winked before the emotionless look returned to his face. I couldn't take it anymore. Promise or not, this wasn't the story I'd wanted. Suddenly I was aware of a bulge of car keys in my left pocket and the mass of my wallet in my right. In what felt like one movement, I stood, yanked the door open, and tore down the hall, down the steps, out the front door, and into my car. I'd left my shoes, kicked off under the desk, but I didn't care. Couldn't even bring myself to look up to see if he was following me. I had put my car in reverse and backed out of the driveway as fast as I could. I nearly dropped the transmission out of the car, slamming it into drive. I made it to a hotel on the other side of town. I must have scared the receptionist half to death with my bloody feet and bloodshot eyes, but she gave me a room, so I didn't care. Inside, I shuffled to the bed, closed my eyes, and fell onto the sheets face first. Click. I squeezed my eyes shut, racing towards sleep. Squeak. I was almost there. I could feel reality falling and twisting away, but I wasn't fast enough. "All out of ideas," he crooned. I reluctantly opened my eyes to find his mere inches away from mine. Someone was screaming. The sound pulled me from a dream, and I woke in the dark, short of breath and damp with sweat. It was my mother, I realized. Have you ever noticed how you can recognize the voice of one close to you, even through as little as a cough or a cry? There's no need for words. I heard and knew it was her. I sat up in bed, confused and frightened. The screams had stopped, but I could still hear talking downstairs. My parents. I slid out from beneath the covers and crept to my door, bare feet cold on the ancient wooden boards. A decade had passed, but I still remember the strongest details. The way those floorboards creaked, the dust that made me sneeze, the shadows of the night clouds slipping silently across the scene, nipping at my heels. All these things, as meaningless as they were, are burned into me, like scars when I close my eyes. Mom and Dad's voices were raised, upset. In our old home, they would have woken the neighbors by now. But not here, not in the middle of nowhere. There was no one within a mile. I held the door handle and eased it down so it made no sound, stepping into the hallway, leaving my door open behind me. Moonlight spilled out around my feet, a pale wash chasing shadows into the corners. Felt like I'd only been asleep for a few hours, but I couldn't be certain. I worked my way to the top of the stairs, a few inches at a time. I could make out occasional words from below, but nothing yet that made any sense. I'd stopped to listen when the door beside me creaked open, making me jump. My younger sister, Maria, was only 6, all wide eyes and worried face and tousled black hair that hung wild around her. I recall thinking it was odd that our brother Ryan hadn't left his room. Usually if our parents woke us up with their arguing, he would be up first, to get us back to sleep and tell us not to worry, to tell us not to listen. "Go to bed," I hissed at her. She frowned and retreated, but kept the door ajar. I tiptoed forward onto the top step, listening. My father, loud and demanding. "Tell you again. Now don't make me do it, Lisa." "Do what?" My mother's angry, tearful. Crazy. Don't do this. Call the police. Phone an ambulance. Please, David, please. Her voice went on as I heard footsteps approaching the stairs. They were coming up. A surge of panic, and I turned, rushing back to my room. I caught my sister peering around her doorframe and mouthed, "Go!" to her as I passed. The footsteps behind me grew closer, my mother's voice clear. I climbed back into bed, heart racing, when I heard her feet in the hallway. They went into Ryan's room, which was opposite of Maria's, but not their own opposite mine. Why, I wondered. Where was my brother? Dad was speaking, voice thick and heavy. He told Mom to sit down, then again louder, and she snapped a reply I couldn't make out. "Did you break the rules I gave you?" he asked her. "Did any of you?" My mother replied inaudibly. "Did you break any of the rules I gave you?" His voice raised again. "Just answer me!" "No." Her voice broke as she shouted back. "No! Please, David, for God's sake, phone an ambulance. It might not be too late. It might not. You don't know. You don't know it." "Did anyone come in the house?" He cut her off, tone low and threatening. "Did any of you leave?" "No, David, please." She was still speaking when I heard him step into the hall. Then the door closed and keys rattled. My mother's voice rose to a scream, and I could hear her running across the floor. "What are you doing?" Her hands were hammering on the door. "David, what are you doing? Don't hurt them, David. Don't you hurt our girls. David, please." Why would she say that, I thought. He would never hurt us. My father would never hurt me. What was going on? I heard the creak of floorboards beneath her cries, and then Dad opened my sister's door. He spoke quietly. I couldn't make it out. Maria's door closed and locked. Then he was walking again, towards my room. Mom was still shouting, sobbing, calling our names, words collapsing into each other until they were only sounds of frustration, pain, and rage. My door opened. I looked over the edge of the covers, pretending I was still asleep. I was so scared, I didn't know what else to do. My father stood in the doorway. He was holding a shotgun, and it was pointed at my chest. "Evie, sweetheart, we need to talk." We had only been in the house for a week. If everything had went to plan, we would have been gone before another month had passed. At the beginning of the year, Dad's elder brother had passed away. He was the only one living member on that side of the family, so my father inherited everything. Our parents were contacted by a law firm who had been engaged as executors of the will, and a meeting was organized to discuss the details. Now, our dad hadn't spoken to his brother in decades, or anyone on his side of the family for that matter. Ryan, Maria, and myself had never met any of them. Dad would never talk about them. Strangely, he seemed more worried than upset by the news of our uncle's death. When my parents attended the meeting, the true scope of the inheritance was revealed. The home, left to him, was more than a century old and had once housed 20 family members and staff. 3 floors, basement, attic, outhouse, and miles of property. At present, most of the place was filled with an accumulation of possessions of 5 generations of rich landowners. The contents alone could be worth a small fortune. The house and the grounds certainly were. My mom, shocked and delighted, couldn't wait to tell us. Dad, however, remained taciturn, simultaneously unsurprised and pained by his apparent good fortune. He didn't want to accept it, he said. Our mother couldn't believe him and demanded to know why. Because of the condition of the will, he told her. We would all have to move there and take possession of the house. No one except family could be allowed inside, not under any circumstances. But he didn't want to go back there, no matter what the offer was. He certainly wouldn't take his wife and children to that godforsaken place. Mom was furious. She thought it was crazy to turn it down. So what if he had to move there? His refusal to explain any further only made it worse. They argued on and off for weeks. There was a silence between them that went on for days until we were in bed. Then the arguments would begin again. Why wouldn't he accept the house? She would ask. Why wouldn't he explain? My father never answered, just repeated the same refusal and denials. Whatever happened there's over, I heard her say one night. You never spoke to them, never spoke about any of them. They're gone. I'm your wife. We're your family, here and now. I lay awake in bed, picking out bits and pieces as I tried to sleep. I never heard the final argument, but Ryan did. He told me and Maria about it on the walk to school. Mom said she had spoken to a lawyer of her own about the will. We could move there for just a short time, she said, maybe only a month. Then we claim we can't stay because it's hurting the kids' upbringing. It wouldn't even be a lie. There isn't a good school for 40 miles, police or ambulance for that matter. No other families are nearby. It's isolated. We say it's affecting all our mental health. There's no living relatives to contest with. My lawyer thinks that we could fight it out in court and win. Afterwards, we sell what we can and keep what we like. Do anything we want. We'll be rich, David. No more 5 people living in 2 bedrooms. We could do whatever we want. All we have to do is make it look like we tried. My father hadn't replied. Then Mom told him that she would leave with us if he didn't accept it. Divorce. To be refusing this opportunity, just throwing away all our futures, she said, over reasons that he couldn't even explain. If he could be that stupid and selfish, then he didn't deserve to be our father, and wasn't the man that she thought he had been. David had left after that, Ryan told us. Went out for hours during the night. The 2 of them didn't speak at all the next day. Then a week later, our parents sat us down and said they had news. We were going away together to clear out and sell the old house that we had inherited. It should only be a month or so, they said. Then we could come back home. I need you to tell me what you done today. Dad? I began to cry, unable to hold back the tears. What's going on? Why is... Answer me, Evie. I don't want to hear anything else. Tell me what happened today, and nothing else. You understand? When I drove back to the city this afternoon, did someone come to the house? Did any of you leave? Tell me true. He never came any closer than the doorway, keeping the gun on me the entire time. Nothing happened. I was too upset to think clearly, unable to take it all in. My mother told him we never left the house, didn't she? Why had she lied? Was Dad gonna hurt me if he found out? I glanced at the wall beside my room, and he noticed. You heard what we were saying, me and your mom. Of course you did. I didn't reply. I just wiped away the tears and tried to hold back any more. It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you, baby. The barrel lowered. I could see his eyes were red where he'd been crying. This was hurting him, I realized. Doing this was hurting him. I just need you to tell me the truth. This is very important, Evie. What did you do today? Did you go out? I was just a child, overwhelmed and confused. Every time in my life I'd been frightened, I would run to my dad. Every time I needed someone, I could call his name and he'd be there. Now he was the one I was scared of, and I was lost. I started to get out of bed to go to him, but he pulled back, the gun snapping up. No! He pointed the weapon right at me. Stay where you are. Don't move. Back on the bed. There was a pleading in his eyes and voice. Please, Evie, don't make me. I had never seen him angry and emotional like this. Never in my life. He'd never even shouted at me before. He just wasn't that type of man. Evie, tell me right now, did any of you leave the house today? Yes. I saw it hit him. This truth, like a physical blow, sapping the strength from his body. He took a faltered step back and leaned against the doorframe, face paling to ghost white, a sharp intake of breath through his clenched teeth. "We went to the village." I kept talking, not knowing what else to do. I couldn't stop the words once they had started. "All of us, we got separated at the shop, and Mom got angry. Maria, she ran off to see the horses. There were horses in one of the open fields. I went after her, but she wouldn't come back. Mom and Ryan had to help till we found her." I remember that afternoon, chasing my sister down stone side streets under the gray sky. We were just going for a walk. Mom had told us to get out of the house for an hour. She had said, handing us our coats, "But remember, don't tell your dad." She laughed, and Ryan did too. Dad was being silly, we thought. The four of us took a winding path through the trees and across the fields of wet grass until we reached the village. A church, a shop, and a dozen homes. We found everything closed and silent. I didn't see a single other person, not even a face at a window or a passing car. "Maybe no one lives here anymore," Ryan said. Mom didn't say anything. When Maria ran off, I followed, but I couldn't make her come back on her own. I went for my mom and brother. When I found Maria the second time, we all came home. Nothing happened. "How long were you all separated?" My father's words were cold now, flat and emotionless. "How long were you on your own?" I don't know. How long, Evie?" 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. He wasn't looking at me anymore, just staring at the floor. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and backed into the hall. "Daddy, where's Ryan?" He glanced up, our eyes meeting, and I'd never seen hurt on his face like I did then. But he didn't answer me, just swung the door closed and locked it. A minute or so passed, and I could hear him pacing the floor, steps interspersed with cries from my mother, which he ignored. Then his voice, just outside my room. "Evie, I need you to stay here for a little while, baby. Stay away from this door. I'll be back soon, okay?" There was a second pause, and then, "I love you." I heard him go to my sister's room. He spoke to her briefly through the door, then he headed upstairs. My mom kept shouting, calling his name as the footsteps receded. I hadn't even moved since he left, just sat there on the bed, cracked and hollowed out. "Evie?" My mom's voice came from the next room. I went to the wall and knelt down, pressing my ear against it. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" "I'm okay, Mom. Did I do something wrong?" "No, baby, no, of course not. I'm gonna get us out of here, okay? It's gonna be all right. He won't hurt you. I won't let him hurt you. Your dad, he just isn't feeling well. He isn't himself. We'll get help. It's gonna be okay. I promise." I could hear footsteps on the stairs again, and my mom moved away from the wall. The rattle of keys and the door of her room opened. I stayed where I was, still and listening. "Get back to the window, Lisa." My father's voice was colder than before, dead and hardened. "I told you not to go out. Why'd you lie to me?" "You were pointing that gun at me." She didn't cry anymore. Her words were clear and angry. "I was scared. I didn't know what you would do if I told you. I didn't know what to say. I'd seen our... Stop. Tell me what happened today." "We went out, like Evie told you. We went for a walk, David. A grown woman and her children went out for a walk. We're not prisoners, are we? We're not..." "I asked you not to. I've never asked anything of you since we've been together." His voice strained, cracking as he spoke. I've never asked you to do anything for me, change anything for me, not ever. It was just this once I needed you to trust me. One time, follow the rules I gave you." "Why, David, why? You order your family to follow these stupid rules, but you won't explain why. We thought you were losing your mind. All of us did. You've been so strange since we got here. You won't tell me anything. I'm your wife. You act like I'm some idiot who can't be told the truth." "Shut up." His reply was so loud and sudden that I pulled away from the wall. "You don't have any idea. No idea what you've done." "Then tell me." Her voice changed, pleading, understanding. Tell me what's going on. You can tell me, David. We can... Stop it. Stop changing the subject. What happened today in the village? Nothing, David. Nothing happened. We went to the local shop, but it was closed. Walking in the... You got split up. The four of you. Maria ran off. Was gone for 2 seconds, David. You know what she's like. She ran off and Evie went after her. When she couldn't catch her, we split up and found her. Something clattered on the floor. Put 'em on. There's a metal bar underneath the window. Around that. Are you serious? Do it, Lisa. I heard her moving, then the sound of a chain followed by a metallic snap. She started to speak again, but he was already leaving, locking the door behind him. He went to Maria, and a few minutes passed. Voices too quiet to understand. I thought I heard Maria crying, but I couldn't make out any words. I was too afraid to move closer to listen. Then more footsteps. Evie, can you hear me? Yes. My voice wavered, coming out as a broken whisper. I need you to stand away from the door. Back at the window, baby, okay? I'm gonna come in, but I need you to stand there. Do you understand? Uh-huh. Speak properly, Evie. Say you understand. This is important. I understand. Do it now, honey. I scrambled over to the glass on all fours and put my back against the ledge. For a second, I saw the keyhole go dark and realized he was looking through it. Then the door unlocked, and he came in, gun still raised and pointed at me. He had a pistol now as well. I caught a glimpse of it under his shirt, tucked into his belt. His other hand held a pair of handcuffs. He tossed them on the floor, and they skidded to my feet. The metal bar behind you, Evie, under the window. Put the cuffs around that bar, then clip them on your wrist. I nodded, picking them up and trying to do as he asked. You have to trust me, baby, okay? I've always protected you, haven't I? Always. I need you to trust me. The handcuffs clicked into place, and I tightened them as he instructed. Then he backed out again and was gone. Through the window, a full moon flashed beneath the clouds. My breath steamed the glass, and the metal of the cuffs were cold on my skin. All I could do was wait. That house was unusual in many ways, not simply its isolation or my father's fear. Some of these things were small details I didn't pick up at first or thought nothing of, but not all. With the exception of my parents' room, every door was thick, heavy, and locked with a key. The only difference in their door was having no key, just an iron latch on the inside. As for the windows, none could be opened from either side, not on any floor. Those metal bars that he put the cuffs around could be found under every one of those windows. The basement was filled with dusty, battered books we weren't allowed to read, and moldy boxes we weren't allowed to look at. Then there was the attic. My brother had gotten a look inside before Dad sent him back downstairs. It was filled with weapons, Ryan had told me. Old rifles and pistols and crossbows, marked and faded with rust and wear. Every part of the house seemed to be wasting away, decaying like a carcass stripped of its bones. It felt like somewhere you hid from life, not somewhere you lived. There was a story there only my father knew, and it was a story he would never tell. When he returned, he went to my mother first. I shuffled as close to the wall as I could to listen. I've checked every part of this house to be certain. No one else is in here. No one else could have gotten in. It's impossible. That's how this place was built. I know that as well as anyone. I survived here for 16 years. My mother's reply was quiet, barely audible. You're sick, David. You need help. All of this, it's insane. What are you doing here to me, to your family, to our girls, our son, Ryan, our son, David? This is insane. Whoever's done it is in this house, Lisa. You understand that, don't you? Do you get that? He went on as if he hadn't heard her. One of the four of us. Could be you see. Could be you who... Well, we'll find out when the sun comes up. What are you talking about? Please, David, please. I couldn't have told you. You would have thought I was crazy. You'd have taken the kids. I tried to stay away from this place, but you wouldn't listen. Didn't leave me any choice, did you? I should have known better. I did know better, but I still made the wrong decision. I could hear the waver in his speech, the grief and the pain and desperation. David, they aren't like people think, he snapped, suddenly cutting her off. They're patient. Easier to stop in some ways. Much, much harder in others. They need to get you alone. We're safe when we're inside or together, you see. Should never be alone, especially not outside. He paused for a moment, and I pressed close to the wall. The wounds don't even show. I know that. I remember that. So you can't tell. Sometimes they don't even know what they are, Lisa. Like two minds in one body, like a parasite inside, waiting for a chance. David, his words were calm and focused. Listen to me. I don't understand what you're saying. I can't understand. But we can help. Please, whatever it is, whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Put down the gun. Let's go and call for help. We can go home. We can... No, it's too late for that. It's much too late. If you'd done what I asked, just done what I asked, it wouldn't have to be this way. But you never listened to me. Never. I heard movement then, and the door locked again. He went to my sister's room, and a minute later, he came to see me. He was pale, soaked in sweat, bottom lip cracked and bleeding. Evie, I have to do this, honey, okay? To keep you safe, to keep us all safe. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, but we have to do this. They can hide away from the crosses and questions, but the light always hurts them, at least a little. So then we'll know. I think I must have slept eventually. The sound of my father pacing the halls, the occasional shouts of my mother, they all faded as the empty hours passed. I used my feet to pull down the cover and pull it around me as best I could. I thought about my brother. Was he hurt? Mom had wanted to call the police, call an ambulance. Why wouldn't Dad do that? What had happened? Ryan couldn't be dead. No, not my brother. He couldn't be. I watched the forest through the dark windows, its glass now touched with frost. Watched for so long, I didn't know if I was awake or in a dream. The wind sighed and moved, and the shadows followed. And those dark shapes between the trees could have been figures or branches, or nothing at all. Morning was close. As the hours passed, I thought I could hear scraping sounds from Mom's room, very faint, only growing louder when my father was downstairs to use the toilet. When he returned, she began shouting at him again, loud and suddenly. He ignored her for a minute, then, realizing she wasn't going to stop, strode to her room. I heard the lock turn and the creak of hinges. Then it began. Rapid footsteps, followed by a cry, something striking flesh and a person falling, or more than one. My mother cursed, and metal hit the floor. I had sat up, every muscle tensed. I could hear her breathing heavily, moving around the room, lifting and dragging a heavy something. In a second, she was at my door, unlocking it and pulling it open, saying my name. She had the shotgun under one arm, the keys in her hand. She took off my cuffs. Then we were moving together to my sister's room. As I waited for her to open the door, I looked into Ryan's room. My father was on the floor, blood flowing from an ugly wound on the side of his head. Beside him lay the metal bar from under the window frame. I could see the holes in the plaster where my mother had worked it out during the night. He groaned and grabbed my mother's arm to warn her. "Shit!" she cursed as she stepped past me. Then she pulled the door closed and locked it. A minute later, we had my sister and were heading downstairs. As we reached the steps, I heard my father calling our names and slamming against the door. We didn't stop, taking the stairs as fast as we could, clinging to each other. As we reached the ground floor, my mother gave a hard intake of breath and pulled us both towards her, turning our faces away from whatever was there. Another slam came from above us, my father's cries echoing down the stairwell. "Close your eyes for me, both of you. Hold on to me and we'll go together. Keep them closed. Don't open them till we get out, okay? Don't look." We stumbled down those final steps as she held us, guiding us forward. A crash from above made me flinch, but we kept moving. "Go on, almost there." We were in the lounge when I looked again. I saw the hallway to the front door, broke into a run, letting go of my mother's arm. Almost there, I thought. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten until I stopped. The sounds of movement, my mother's voice, the shouts from above, it was all gone. I turned and found myself alone. "Mom? Maria?" I started to walk back. I couldn't imagine going without them. "Mom!" I called. Then I saw them, laying together on the ground, Mom pale and motionless on her back. Maria was crouched over her, her face buried against her neck. My sister looked at me and smiled, teeth and lips black with blood. There was a ragged wound on my mom's throat. A gunshot rang out, a sudden thunder in the cold silence. Maria's body spun and fell across my mom, a thin trail of blood raining down across the dusty floor. I cried out, but I was frozen in place, too shaken and frightened to move. I could see my father swaying, blood in his hair and on his clothes, pistol in his hand, still aimed at my sister's body. Then she started to get up. Her tiny frame rose in jerks, unnatural movements, more like a broken puppet than the girl I'd known. She made it to her feet and turned towards him, her head hanging bloody and limp, still smiling, though. "Daddy." He fired again, and the bullet struck her in the chest, knocking her back to the ground. I scrambled away into a corner, eyes closed and ears covered. Another shot. Then another. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the dark and my heart beating, flashing images that I couldn't push away. When I opened my eyes and took my hands away from my ears, it was over. My father walked towards the still body of his wife and youngest child. His feet dragged, arms hanging limp at his side. The gun fell from his hands and clattered across the wooden floor. He seemed to collapse as he went, falling down to them, making only wordless sounds of loss. I watched him there in the weak light, shaking and weeping over them, over the ruins of his life, broken and emptied of everything but grief. A pain for which no words would suffice. I don't remember getting up, walking to him. I touched his arm, and he saw me at last and pulled me close. The stench of sweat and blood and horror ran across us both, a wound that could never heal, only fester and burn. Outside, the sun was rising. I loved my father, even there at the end. He tried so hard to protect us, to keep us safe. But when humans are afraid, they miss the simplest things. They make mistakes, like thinking my sister was the only one.